William Shakespeare did not have an English dictionary. He was not pulling a dictionary off the shelf to check a spelling or to see if a word meant what he thought it meant. I think we might assume that he must have, because checking a dictionary for so many of us has become such a standard part of our writing process. And in fact, Microsoft Word checks spelling automatically, has a thesaurus there and a dictionary there if we need them. It also may be that Shakespeare is so famous as a wordsmith that he was making up all these words. Critics, in fact, debate just how many words he created. So how could he not have had a dictionary if he was making all those words? Did he not know that he was the first to use words that we now know, like assassination, crimeful, crimeless, well-read? Shakespeare's the most cited author in the OED for these new words as well as for longer-standing words. And yet at his time, the Oxford English Dictionary, this multi-volume work, would have been absolutely inconceivable. For Shakespeare, there wasn't even a pocket English dictionary. He was writing English just as it was coming into its own, just as it was being deemed worthy of respect and worthy of a dictionary. This story of English coming of age and being rewarded with its own dictionaries, is the focus of this lecture. We did not jump from no English dictionaries to the massive Oxford English Dictionary. It took time for dictionary makers to establish the conventions that we take for granted every day. For example, we assume that dictionaries will contain all the words in a language, or at least we assume that it will contain all the words that we would want to look up. But this has not always been the case. We also assume that for any given word, there'll be pronunciation, or pronunciations if there is more than one. There'll be detailed definitions, etymology, maybe even some synonyms. All of that is new. So this lecture will provide some history on modern dictionaries. We'll go back about 400 years so that we can look at how these have developed over time, so that we can look at how we got to the place where the Oxford English Dictionary was even possible. In the process, this lecture will continue to reveal the human hands that are behind dictionaries and give you new ways to think about how these resources became as authoritative and as comprehensive as they now are. So let's turn the clock back a little over 400 years. So this is the end of the 16th century. We get to Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's writing, and as I just said, he was writing without English dictionaries. Now, it's not that he wouldn't have had dictionaries at all, but the dictionaries that would have been available for him would have been bilingual dictionaries. Latin, English, French, English. And the idea here was that if you were trying to learn Latin or French or use those languages, that you might need some English glosses. So he had those as references. But he certainly didn't have one that was English. It's right around this time that English is emerging from the shadow of Latin and French to be seen as a worthy language. In the history of English, after the Norman Conquest, the languages of learning and of administration were French and Latin. And so it took a while for English to reestablish itself as a language that one could be writing high literature in, and that could have its own dictionary. The first English dictionary is published in 1604. It's Robert Cowdrey's A Table Alphabetical. I've brought it in so that you can look at it. What you may first notice is this dictionary is very small. The motivation for this dictionary was to put in the hard words. And in fact, the title of the book tells us exactly that. The title in full is A Table Alphabetical Containing and Teaching the True Writing and Understanding of Hard Usual English Words, borrowed from the Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or French. The idea here was that why would you need to put easy words in the dictionary? The only words that you would need to look up would be the hard words. And this is a period of time when English was borrowing an enormous number of words, especially from Latin, some from Greek, And so those were the words that were finding their way into the dictionary. This very small dictionary has about 3,000 entries, and the definitions may seem surprisingly short to you. So, for example, the word agility, which was a hard word in 1604, is defined as nimbleness or quickness. Definition done. I love seeing some of the words that you find in there to see what was a hard word in 1604. Ocean, apparently, was a hard word. You'll also see words that are now lost in English, a word like amercement, which Caudry defines as penalty. It's also interesting to see the rather loose alphabetical order in Caudry's dictionary. We can forget that even something like alphabetical order is a relatively new practice. And so Caudry actually provides instructions near the beginning of the dictionary for how to look up a word. So he'll say something like, so if it starts with C, go to the section C, and then if the next letter is A, go to A after C. But if you look at Caudry's dictionary, after that second letter, alphabetical order gets a little looser, and not everything would appear in exactly the order we might expect it today. In the centuries since 1604, the history of dictionaries has in some ways been the history of successful theft and plagiarism. I'm always a little reluctant to tell my students that, but it's a fact about dictionaries that dictionaries are often written with other dictionaries on hand, because it's quite hard to think about where you would start writing a dictionary if you weren't working from someone else's. The fact is that most dictionaries we encounter today started with other dictionaries. The scholar Sidney Landau, who's one of the leading experts on lexicography, has written in his book Dictionaries, and here I'll quote him, "The history of English lexicography usually consists of a recital of successive and often successful acts of piracy." And I want to share a funny story here about what people are doing today, knowing that this is happening. The second edition of the New Oxford American Dictionary put a made-up word in it. And the idea was if you put this made-up word in, if someone else was working from your dictionary and you saw that word in someone else's dictionary, you would know that they were plagiarizing from you. And the word that they put in was esquivalence, which is defined as the willful avoidance of one's official responsibilities. So in case you ever need that word, now you have a made-up word for it. But back to 1604. For the next 100 years, dictionaries continued to focus on hard words. And this is a time when dictionary rivalries began. And people can think of dictionaries as very boring resources, but in fact, we've had things called dictionary wars in the history of lexicography. In 1623, a man named Henry Cockram published a dictionary called the English Dictionary, or an interpreter of hard English words. And in it, he noted his own reliance on earlier dictionaries. And I love what he says about this because it is very far from humble. What he says is, "What any before me in this kind have begun, I have not only fully finished, but thoroughly perfected." So he recognizes that he's working with other people's dictionaries. 1656, Thomas Blount publishes another hard word dictionary. He is the first to even make an attempt at etymologies. So he includes etymologies for some of these hard words. 2 years later, a man named Edward Phillips writes a dictionary called The New World of English Words. Now, Phillips, when he published this, just infuriates Blount because Blount is sure that Phillips has plagiarized his dictionary. And so Blount publishes a few years later a book that he calls A World of Errors Discovered in the New World of English Words. So you see that this was a battleground already in the 17th century. The 18th century is a time when we see the hard word tradition where you're only getting the hard words in dictionaries, give way to a philosophy of producing more comprehensive dictionaries. And it's hard to imagine that this move was not, in part at least, spurred by competition with the French. Because in 1694, you saw the publication of the Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française, which was a more comprehensive work. And it's after that that you start to see more comprehensive English dictionaries. Now, perhaps the most famous of these dictionaries is Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language. It's published in 1755, and it's sometimes called the dictionary. And everyone is supposed to know that you're talking about Johnson. The feat of Johnson's dictionary is pretty remarkable. He was working with 6 other men to create this comprehensive work that in the end included over 43,000 headwords. They read literature from about 150 years, and they were pulling quotations from that literature in order to provide evidence for the meanings that they were putting in the dictionary. So this was a dictionary that was including quotes from literature to illustrate usage. Now, modern scholars debate just how prescriptive or descriptive Johnson was. Johnson was clearly interested in what was happening to the language and interested in capturing that in his dictionary. But he also had some fairly prescriptive attitudes about what was good and bad in the language, and those find their way into the dictionary. Johnson himself admits that when he started the dictionary, he believed that a dictionary could fix the language. And here, this is the meaning of fix as in keep stable. That if you put the language into a dictionary, that would keep those meanings fairly stable, as opposed to the change that he was seeing in the language. But he then includes a very interesting quote in his preface. And he writes here, and this is after he's finished the dictionary, and we see the realization that comes with that. So he writes, "The lexicographer may be derided, who being able to produce no example of a nation that has preserved their words and phrases from mutability, shall imagine that his dictionary can embalm his language and secure it from corruption and decay." So he has come to the realization that a dictionary cannot and will not stop language change. Now, the sheer scope of this dictionary is one of the things that makes it so famous. It's also often set up as creating a new standard for what a dictionary should be in terms of how many words would go in it, using quotations for illustration. One of the things I love about it is that there's also personality in this dictionary. People don't realize that if you go into Johnson, you can find these quotes where Johnson is playing. So let me read you a few of these quotes, and some of these are quite famous. He defines oats as a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland appears to support the people. Of a lexicographer, so writing of himself, he says, "A writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words." He then defines dull as not exhilarating, not delightful, as to make dictionaries is dull work. And then a wonderful one, he defines patron, and of course he had a patron, or at least started the project with a patron. So here he defines patron, one who countenances, supports, or protects, commonly a wretch who supports with indolence and is paid with flattery. As you might sense, Johnson's relationship with his own patron, Lord Chesterfield, was not always a good one. In fact, there was a public dispute over the patronage and over the dictionary. And Johnson felt that the patronage he was receiving was too minimal. Now, quirky definitions continue to this day, and it can be telling of the age in which a dictionary is written. Sometimes these definitions are not as personality-driven as the Johnson ones feel, but they can be socially telling. For example, I remember this was in the 1990s when I looked up the word gender in the Oxford English Dictionary, second edition, and what I found as one of the definitions of gender was a feminist euphemism for sex. And I thought, this is not a feminist euphemism. This is a technical term within feminist theory. That definition has since been revised in the third edition online. But what it should do is remind us of the very human nature of this project and the challenges that all dictionary makers face as they try to define with objectivity at any given moment in time. So now let's jump to the 19th century and a very well-known dictionary, which is Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language. This is published in 1828, and it is seen as the quintessential American project. Now, Webster actually first became famous for his blue-backed speller. And we've brought a blue-backed speller for you to see. This was a remarkable book in terms of its popularity. By 1850, when the U.S. population was about 23 million, this book sold about 1 million annually. So this is a book that would defeat almost any bestseller list. He published a shorter dictionary in 1806, and then in 1828 he published his well-known dictionary, the American Dictionary of the English Language. Now, when Webster published his dictionary, he saw himself as in direct competition with Johnson in some ways, or the revised version of Johnson. And he criticized Johnson for including what he called vulgar words. And Webster took all of those out of his dictionary. Webster's dictionary contained about 70,000 headwords, so that was about 10,000 more than the revised Johnson. And it's fair to see this as a competition where dictionary makers were aware of how big other dictionaries are. We have Webster to thank for some of the American spellings that we know today that differ from British spellings. He saw this as a patriotic project, and part of it was if America was going to have its own language, it needed to have its own spelling system. So things like the ER in theater versus RE, the OR in honor as opposed to OUR, defense with SE as opposed to CE, and realize with a Z at the end as opposed to an S. These are all things that Webster introduced, and we'll talk about that more in a later lecture. So I've now set the stage for what is probably the most remarkable accomplishment in the history of English lexicography, and perhaps in lexicography more generally. And that is the Oxford English Dictionary. This dictionary is a prized acquisition in any home library. Some of you may own one, and perhaps you have the magnifying glass that goes with it. When it was first published, it was described by the New York Times as a treasure house for scholars and a source of instruction and delight for the ordinary reader. The Oxford English Dictionary has now gone online, and it is a go-to resource for all of us who study the history of the language, who study literature, or who just enjoy words. At the end of the last lecture, I asked you to consider how you might respond if someone said, let's create a dictionary that tells the history of every word in the English language. I have to admit that my reaction would be, that is a great idea. I hope somebody else does that. What a project to think about telling the history of all the words, and we've talked about how many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of words we're talking about, and to tell their history back to the year 1100, so almost a millennium in the history of English. But in fact, this is exactly what happened in the middle of the 19th century. It was November of 1857, London, and Richard Chevenix Trench gave a paper before the Philological Society, and the paper was called On Some Deficiencies in Our English Dictionaries. What he was proposing was a dictionary to surpass all dictionaries that had ever been published up to that point. That he foresaw a biography of the language, a history of meaning. And there are descriptions of this that he gives this paper, and there's applause, and then the project starts, and over the next 20 years, it sort of dies. There was some work done over those 20 years, including a call for volunteer readers in both Britain and in the US. And this is a really important part of the Oxford English Dictionary project and worth explaining. That the editors of the OED were not thinking that they could read all the literature that needed to be read and find all those words, all those quotations. That they put out this call for volunteers asking people to select works they wanted to read and write down the words that they found in there on little slips of paper. And they would put the word, the head word, on the left-hand side, and then under that they would put the date of the work that they were reading, and then they would provide the full quotation, the full title of the work, and then they would send that in. They weren't supposed to provide definitions. That was for the OED editors to do. So the call had gone out, but for the most part, the project for those 20 years was slowly dying. But in 1879, a man named James A.H. Murray became the editor of the OED. He managed to get a contract for the work he thought needed to be done, and he reissued the call for volunteers. And he reminded readers that he didn't need only the fancy words, because of course a lot of what people were sending in were all the fancy words that they were finding, because they thought, oh, well, those are the words that they'll need for the dictionary. And he was reminding people that they also needed slips for make and do and words like that. So readers pored over literature and sent words in to the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary. The OED took over 40 years to complete, and there were 3 chief editors over that period of time. Murray, in fact, did not live to see the end of the project. It's truly an outstanding accomplishment. But I think that it is important to remember that this was all done by hand. This is the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So obviously no computers. This work, in fact, was happening in a shed called the scriptorium. And there was a wall of pigeonholes in which the editors who worked with Murray were categorizing all the slips that were coming in. Thousands, hundreds of, or thousands of slips coming in every month, getting put into these pigeonholes. The slips, when they came in, were checked for accuracy. They were then sorted alphabetically. Then, for any given word, they were sorted by part of speech. So if you had a word that was both a noun and a verb, you had to separate those out. And then you took those quotes and you ordered them chronologically so that you could try to see the development of meaning over time. And I like to imagine that some of that sorting of slips was probably happening on tables, perhaps on the floor of the scriptorium, as they tried to organize all the slips for a given word. The sub-editor would then take a first shot at writing a definition. Murray would insert etymology, pronunciation. He would pick the best quotations and write the final definition. In the end, there were over 5 million slips sent into the OED. The first edition of the OED was 10 volumes and over 400,000 headwords. To support those 400,000 headwords, there are at least 1.8 million quotations in there. If you think about a verb like take, it was an enormous project to try to define all the historical meanings of take, and there are over 200 meanings of that verb in the Oxford English Dictionary. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about the history of the Oxford English Dictionary, I recommend a couple of books to you. You may have heard of Simon Winchester's book, The Professor and the Madman, in which he tells the story of the biggest volunteer contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, who was an American named William Chester Minor, who was in an insane asylum in Britain. And what Minor did was, in fact, create an index from all the works that he was reading, and then asked Murray, what words do you need? And then he could use the index to go back to his works, to his literature, and pull the quotations that Murray needed. Linda Mugglestone's The Hidden History of the OED is also a wonderful story of the making of this work. Of course, the dictionary is filled with problems, too, which is why there have been supplements and there have been revisions. When you think about a dictionary that size, created over 40 years, there are, of course, going to be problems in that. And editors continue to work those through. And, of course, the language is also changing. The OED is now being edited for the 3rd edition, and you can see the difference that the web makes. The revised entries are becoming available in batches in the online OED as they are ready. And I once heard that there would be only one print edition of the 3rd edition that would go to the Queen, but I'm not even sure if that will happen. The web has also helped people out there who like to try to predate the OED. And there's something of a sport here to see if you can find a quotation that is earlier than a quotation in the OED. The OED also continues to appear in newspapers, reflecting our fascination with what counts as a word and what might make it into the OED. For example, the OED made headlines in March of 2011 when it included a whole new set of words, including acronyms like LOL and FYI, OMG and BFF. And that was something that people were really interested in. One website asked the OED to stay boring and respectable and not include such words. But the editors of the OED would argue that part of the respect for the OED comes from its comprehensiveness, which is that it includes slang and colloquialisms. What I like about the press coverage is it shows our fascination with how language changes, our concern about that, and our trust in dictionaries, both to capture the language and to show us what should be happening with the language. The 20th century has seen a proliferation of dictionaries. This turns out to be a very profitable thing, or at least it used to be. Many of us got a dictionary when we graduated from high school, but the world has changed now as things have gone online. So print dictionaries have gone online, and now there are new dictionaries happening online. And it's become a really fascinating democratic process as people can contribute to dictionaries as they are being built. I think that in the end, there's a reason why dictionaries often, or almost always, don't have the editors' names on them. That they are in fact distancing themselves from the dictionary, that what they would say is the meanings of this are up to you, and that the dictionary itself benefits from that distance, that we see it as authoritative because we're not entirely sure who edited it. But as I've said, we as dictionary users do well to remember that there are people behind every dictionary that we use, and they are incredibly knowledgeable people who are using all the evidence that they can find to show us what is happening in our own language. In the next lecture, we will turn to the kinds of changes in meaning that words can undergo, the kinds of changes that are captured in the Oxford English Dictionary. As we go through all those definitions and all the quotations that the editors so meticulously created for us, we can create a narrative of how that word moved from one meaning to the next. It's not their job to create that narrative, but we can use the information to do that. So, for example, how did the word wench go from meaning a child to its current meaning of servant or prostitute or unpleasant woman? How did nice used to mean silly? How are clues related to yarn? We will turn to these questions and many other words that have equally interesting stories to tell in the next lecture.